Why is something reality? Reality creates its opposition, the lie, the fantasy. What difference would there be between fantasy and lie? Only the fact that the fantasy accepts that it is not reality, and the lie imposes a fantasy as reality. The fantasy accepts that it is not reality, and the lie imposes a falsehood as reality. But as the reality itself can only be a series of agreements between two or more consciousnesses, who determines what reality is or is not, other than those who control those agreements? For example, the Cabal. So reality can only be objective, because consciousnesses, if they are not the whole, the source, only have a limited perception. So everything outside that limited perception becomes fantasy, unreality. Unless something with the authority to create agreement comes to impose that what could not be observed before and therefore was outside the reality of consciousnesses, is something that is now reality. As would be the case with radio waves or microwaves. Before they were not reality, today they are. But who imposed that? An authority, under the excuse that it is a new discovery. But since it is an authority, they will decide what new discoveries are convenient for them to become realities and which ones are not. So we get into the idea that something is there, but people cannot perceive it. Therefore, they do not see it as reality. Example of this are ghosts, UFOs. There are those who wish to impose that as reality, because it is their reality for whatever reasons, and they will tell others to wake up to that. But that is outside their realm of perception, which is not only what they can see and feel empirically, but also their perception of how things are, in the sense that they must be validated by an authority. But objectively, do things really exist that cannot be seen or verified in any way from the point of view of a perception of a particular person? From their point of view, no. A normal person may know for herself that UFOs do not exist. She knows, because she has never seen one. She knows that the authorities do not accept that they exist. She knows that the science, which is the ultimate knowledge, dictates that it is very difficult for anything to travel those vast interstellar distances. She knows that YouTube videos are hacked, that they manipulate photos in magazines even before internet. I know of a case where two brothers took photos of a jar lid with a high-speed camera. They took multiple photos flipping the lid like a frisbee, and they printed the photos and sent them to a ufologist in their country. And they took them for real. They investigated the photos in detail and saw that it had no strings, that the photos were true. They printed dozens of magazines with the jar lid on the cover. Those brothers know that there are no UFOs, because if they created such a scandal with a simple jar lid, others surely did too, in their own way. So for them, there are no UFOs, because there is always an explanation. They are empirically basing themselves on their own experience with what they did just for fun, they cannot and never will be able to believe unless confirmed by an authority. So there are no UFOs. Not for them. That is their reality. But from my perspective now, I am sitting inside a UFO. It is impossible for me to conceive the idea that they do not exist. They do not seem strange or anything to me. I understand them well, to the extent that you could argue that it is just a kind of a plane, much more advanced than the ones you have there, but plane nevertheless. My reality does not match theirs. From my perspective, they are wrong. They are ignorant. From their perspective, I don't exist. I am a figment in the imagination of two crazy YouTubers who do it for money and to attract attention. Point here with all this is that reality can only be relative to one point of view. I can't tell those two that they are wrong. That is imposing my point of view on them. And it would make me a person just as nefarious as anyone else. Like Stalin, Joseph Goebbels, or Mao, imposing my point of view. That is why nothing should be imposed, only offer, without criticizing those who do not want what you offer. So, there is a reality for each consciousness, and it is as valid as that of any other. It is their experience, and even though it's still correct that the higher density, the more things you understand, but it does not mean that it is superior. Only that it's how you designed your life for the experience you will have. There is no objective, tangible, and absolute reality. Everything is relative. The only thing that could come close to that kind of reality is the source itself, the whole. But from our also limited position, what we define as the source and the whole is not, and it is a reductionist explanation. Change of an angle. The higher a density, the easier it is to manifest, because one is more energy in a perceptible state by said consciousness as fluid. From a lower and simpler density, everything manifests more slowly. Slowly is a key. Why is it slower? Because manifesting something, for something to exist, must be sustained as an idea that is constant, focused, not dispersed. Because the higher the density, the more data you are processing simultaneously. The lower, the less data, because your perception of reality is simpler, more reduced, so you do not understand the management of energy. You have agreed to see it as something causal and fixed, what they call the material world, and not as an idea, a thought. At low densities, the ideas tend to be very fixed, imposed by authorities. Hence, agreements based on those ideas as well. So, the consciousnesses do not focus on what they want, because by agreements, they see everything as impossible. That is what they have been told, that they cannot manifest a drawer full of money, because that is impossible. They imagine it, but it stops there. It doesn't materialize. They see imagination as opposed to material reality. when they themselves can have the ability to see that everything they call material reality was once imagination. They have it in front of them, yet they don't see it. The entire material world, as perceived from high densities, is imagination. The only thing that separates high and low densities is perception agreement. Again, the only thing limiting you is the idea that you are limited. Everything that is seen, everything that is perceived as the external world is the result of countless agreements of perception. And there is nothing outside of such perception agreements. What you can do in the material world depends solely on your mind and your mental state. It has been proven that if you put two people in a city far from where they were, thousands of miles away from where they were, and under equal circumstances, you give them both two changes of clothes, a pair of shoes, a backpack, and $10. And you throw them in a corner of a strange city. One was of the lower or middle class, the other was an entrepreneurial millionaire. After a couple of months, one is still in poverty, the other is already building a business. After 6 months, one at least has a job, the other already has a house of his own and 2 cars. It is their mental state, their perception of how things are and how things work that determines people's reality. From high densities, an idea is reality. What comes to mind is, without questioning. At medium densities upwards, you still experience things happening to you. You can focus on what you remember of how things were when you were at lower densities, like the misnamed 3D and 5D. But you also keep dreaming and leave all agreements behind. You know how to focus on what you want, and that is, everything in front of you gets transformed. Everyone experiences that. They are called dreams. What you have in mind is what you will dream. And if you dream mundane things, it is only because you have that in mind. But in the dream, everything is as real or more than in what you would call the objective and real world of being in wakefulness. When you die, you only become what you dream of. What you have in mind is what you will see. Your mind, your values and ideas, your agreements or agreeing not to have agreements is your reality, and that is what you see. There is no objective reality. Everything is dreaming. Or there is objective reality only if you wish. But dreaming for someone else is their objective reality, and no one has the right or the authority to impose one reality on another. When you are in a low density, 3D or 5D by reference, I hate those numbers, you have a lot of attention on the progression of how things are happening in your perception. That is why time is perceived as linear, while in the dream it is not, or it is only for short periods of a sequence of events. Then you jump to something else with your attention. The higher in densities you are in consciousness, time becomes more and more plastic, because you stop seeing things in a simple and linear way, and you start connecting everything that you perceive as your reality with other things. You see more connections between all things, events, and ideas. You no longer see a fixed sequence, or you begin to understand that there are other kinds of sequences. As in, when the events that from 3D or 5D are seen as a succession of events, from above, they are seen with another connection, where if you glued them from 3D or 5D, the sequence would jump from one point in time to another, then forward, then back again, outside of linear time, creating its own linearity for the consciousness that observes, progression of events that have nothing to do with a calendar, clock, or what happened after what according to what year. In other words, you create your own sequence of events. But it gets even more complicated, because what is described above is still linear, even if it is in the unique manner of said consciousness. Higher up, it becomes even more complicated, because events are perceived not only with their own linearity that contrasts that of 3D and 5D, but they also jump from a timeline or parallel universe into another and another, also in reverse or without sequence. And that in itself not only creates its own logic of events of what reality is, but from the point of view of the consciousness that experiences that, everything from that position makes much more sense than from the position of linear observation, creating in turn its own agreements and the way of seeing reality, its own universe with its own laws, completely incompatible and incomprehensible for a consciousness in a lower state or of low densities, to use understandable terminology. Even so, always under the same principle, it is only about how one processes what is understood by perception, by facts and agreements, but internally, not as in observing what happens outside of oneself, because there is nothing outside of oneself but what the ideas that the very consciousness holds for itself mean, its values, and how it applies them in its existence. Remaining in a state of consciousness where what is or is not real is delegated to another person or authority is the reason why one remains in a low density. But there are no densities. That is again agreement and perception. Rather, as we said before, there is an existential density for every consciousness that exists. It is only determined by the range of things you can perceive, but this from the point of view of a higher density than that of that example. From one's personal position, it is only his density, and what is outside his perception and understanding simply does not exist. And whatever is outside his perception and understanding really does not and cannot exist for that person consciousness. Asks Robert. That is to say that those who manage to manifest things faster would be in a higher density? It depends on what things, because humans are very good and very quick to manifest things. Too bad those things are nightmares. Therefore, the speed of manifestation is not decisive, but what is manifested according to the question what is desired and what is not desired. So you would understand something very important, and what I have described before in another context: the ability to create matter from energy, or rather, the ability to materialize your thoughts at will, and not with your thoughts materializing the world for you, as it happens to consciousness in a low state. Comments Robert. But within this density gradient, because it is a gradient, those who have the ability to manifest things and be happy would therefore have a higher frequency. It can be interpreted as a gradient, because there is no other way to explain it. But in itself, it does not have to be a gradient. Again, it is just an idea. It is that if they can materialize good things for themselves, they would have to be in what we interpret as a higher density. Because what they want is what comes to them, and that defines it as not being in a causal, deterministic world, but in a dream that progresses at will only with the things that are desired, without needing drama or anything like that. Thank you, Yázhi, for this great presentation on the subject. A question now. How exactly get to develop this state of consciousness outside the limits, agreements, breaking rules of reality? How to develop our potential to the maximum? How to manifest all our dormant powers practically? Increasing your knowledge and understanding of alternative points of view to yours. Absorbing and understanding without judging the points of views and worlds and agreements of what you would call other people, knowing that understanding those who think differently from you only magnifies you, makes you understand everything more, expands you. Not having fixed ideas, but always evolving, discarding previous ideas in favor of new ones, without demeriting the previous ones, keeping them as alternatives. All without attachments, apart from the attachment to change, to evolve, to leave everything behind. But without having to leave behind what serves you now. You don't have to live as a Buddhist monk with nothing in an empty room, but rather enjoy what you have, be it matter, people, or ideas, knowing that the more complex your causal or external to you as seen from a low-density point of view life is, the less time you will have for introspection. Because having many things and many friends and many responsibilities will overwhelm you, and you will always live in a deterministic state. If you have many things, you will no longer have many things, because you will no longer enjoy them. They lose their value for you. And those things will have you instead, for the responsibilities they entail. It is a long process of living this way, always expanding and always asking yourself things without attachments, always changing as the only constant. Asks Robert. But when we get into 3D here, have we delegated our power? Or do we only delegate it once we are in here, with the control of the perception of things? And here in this 3D, who have we delegated our power to manifest to? What name does it have? Cabal? Federation? Or ourselves from higher planes? Power from here has been delegated to all of those on your list, to one degree or another. There is also a component of prenatal life plans. But even so, everything is still an idea. The idea that those organisms limit you. The idea that you limited yourself before you incarnated. It's just one more belief system. A child, when entering, is all clean. He is only potential to be everything. And it is the society in which he lives that is repressing him, imposing on him the value systems that will determine the perception agreements with which and by which he will live the rest of his life. You said it was a long way to get to the state where you can change the rules of your reality. I imagine that you have not done any concrete meditation techniques, but you have mentioned certain clock exercises before. Something practical for people to reach this state? I thought the described above was the practical. What they want is to have skills tomorrow, and that is difficult. They need to be immersed in that state of consciousness of the whole, of accepting everything and incorporating it into their being. Yes, I have temporal fragmentation exercises, for example, but they will be of little use if you continue with the same deterministic mentality, because your agreements will have more force than doing a few simple exercises. The "you can't" is what slows you down. You have to get rid of that mentality first, and it is in the way described above. Asks Robert. Who empowers an authority to decide what is real and what is not? Us? The collective? Unconscious people, or someone from above? Yes, in exchange for a false protection that the state gives the individual, he delegates his power to decide for himself. If you allow me, I will say one more thing. For a long time, I have been pushing the concept that everything is false, that you live in a simulation, that 3D is not considered as a true physical world, that you live inside a matrix, that they impose things that are not true, that the history is false because they hide the true one. From my point of view, or that of many, to a greater or lesser degree, that is still true. But I have also said that everyone sees what they want to see and what they want to experience, and for a long time. The need to develop a sense of self-responsibility for our whole person, identity, and what we can or decide to take for truth or true. We have also been saying it for a long time. So, from the personal point of view, or from each person, regardless of who they are, how informed or awake, what that person, what each person or individual sees as reality is, by definition, reality for that person. And from their point of view or point of view awareness, that is reality and nothing else. And saying that one reality is more true than another, or that this or that reality is false, would only apply from another point of view, never from the same point of view of the subject whose reality is being questioned. It is here where governments impose a reality of a few on a mass of people who have delegated their power to decide for themselves the course of their lives. And this is the definition of a government. government that in turn comes out of themselves as a reflection of their values. But by definition, the values that will be transferred to their government will be those consistent with the needs of control or dominance, frustrations, and lack of power of the people themselves, thus creating a reflection of the worst qualities of the population in the government that rules over them. So, in order to obtain a position of power in said government, it is necessary to have certain qualities that are the worst in the people, and in a scalar way, needing an increasing level of psychopathy. So, back to what is reality. The simplest definition as a unit of reality is, for me, the system of values, beliefs, and points of view with their perspectives and their contexts, particular to each point of attention consciousness. That is, each person has their own reality, and that is reality, and is as valid as that of any other point of attention person. The problem here is that the human being lives in society and has the strong tendency to have a hive mind, where it delegates everything as we said above, creating with this a series of collective agreements monitored and imposed by a government that comes out of themselves, but is a reflection of their worst qualities. So, it is the human mentality itself, their inability to reason and to be able to decide for themselves what is true, delegating it to a power system that is ill by definition, and that therefore will only look after its own interests, which will cause a civilization to progressively fail due to the progressive increase in the level of psychopathy in its rulers, until it reaches its inevitable collapse. Applied only to solve the question, what is reality? The reality is relative to each person, to each soul, to its evolutionary level and capacity of understanding. There will only be a collective reality applying agreements or observing agreements between people with their own reality. But this collective reality will only be a series of agreements and will never be seen in the same way, nor interpreted in the same way by individuals that compose it. But the reality itself is particular to each person, because each person is also a timeline by right. What each person decides what their reality is reality for that person. The moment in which this right to decide what is the reality of each person is not respected, the problems begin. Lack of respect and inability to work together to form a collective reality that nurtures all elements of the group. And this depends on the level of development of consciousness, ethical, moral, and mental development of each person. That will be reflected in his government as is logical. In this case, and with these arguments, everything is real. Everything you can think of is real. What you imagine is also real, because it is the starting point to materialize something, whatever. As we have said before, everything was once imagination. It can be seen as the point of creation of a new reality or component of reality, creative process. But for me, It comes from another timeline, where that already is, however crazy is the imagined, and that is passed to the present one as a concept that a person who receives it, who has the compatibility in mental or consciousness frequencies to read said energetic component, that is interpreted as something just imagined. From high densities and dimensions, there is no time, and there are no distances. So everything is already. Nothing is created. Nothing is ever destroyed. Information is only passed from one timeline to another, from a density that supports the concept to be imagined in the form of harmonics of a frequency to another point, where this is not yet observed by the level of consciousness of those who inhabit it. All just animated with the seemingly linear progressive timeline by the limited consciousness of those who live in such low densities. This is maintaining that time is nothing more than a mental animation based on the capacity of a soul or point of attention to know itself existing. Time depending on consciousness. In short, everyone has the right and the obligation to create their own reality. But he does not have the right to impose his reality on another or others. But it depends on the ethical level and development of the soul in general, density where each person is. Understanding that you can never fully understand everything and about everything. From low densities, or from any density itself, you do not have the ability to understand everything. So taking into account that what characterizes a soul is its need for continuous expansion, that is why it exists, the only position that would be adequate is the acceptance that you can never understand everything, and that you always need to have the ability to change one concept or fact for another, when the new one makes more sense than the old one, without attachments of any kind. Understanding that everything must be let go in favor of something more expanded, because that's what souls do. They expand eternally, not keeping attachments of any kind, especially not sticking to ideas and concepts that will always be limited. Understand that each person has their own level of understanding, and that they may or may not understand yours. You can offer him an understanding, but you can never force him to change anything or to adopt yours. Expansion is all a soul wants. Holding attachments to ideas inhibits growth. This is especially obvious in the case of an authority imposing a fact on a person or people, because it does not do so from the position of offering knowledge, but rather of imposing something in order to gain personal gain. This is due to their inherently low ethical, spiritual, and moral development. Develop your own realities. Take responsibility for yourselves and for what you decide the reality is for each of you. Always in harmony with the realities of those around you. Nurturing information with one another, with total wisdom that everything is always limited in understanding and subject to personal perspectives. live in peace.